Mr. Blair, seconded by Ms. Fortier, moves that Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, firearms, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Debate. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness.
Well, good morning, Madam Speaker, and thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I am very honored today to have the opportunity and privilege to take part in this debate and to introduce to this House Bill C-21 at its second reading. Madam Speaker, Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, is a historic and important step forward for Canada in creating a safer country. Madam Speaker, this legislation proposes to introduce some of the strongest gun control measures in our country's history. It represents the culmination of many years of work and strong advocacy from the victims of gun crimes in this country. We have listened to those victims. We've listened to police chiefs across the country who have urged successive governments to bring in stronger measures, recognizing that community safety and gun control is a factor of community safety and a necessary legislative requirement in order to keep our communities safe. As Dr. Nadia Ahmed, the co-chair of the Doctors for Protection from Guns, has said about this bill, this is a comprehensive bill that, when enacted, will save lives. Madam Speaker, Canada is generally a very safe country, and Canadians take great pride, but they are concerned, legitimately concerned, about the threats posed by firearm-related crime in their communities. Madam Speaker, it's important to begin with the recognition and acknowledgement that gun ownership in Canada is not a right, it is a privilege. It's a privilege earned by gun owners who obey our laws, who purchase their guns legally, use them responsibly, store them securely. And it is through the strict adherence to our laws, regulations, and restrictions that Canadians earn the privilege of firearm ownership. And I want to acknowledge that the overwhelming majority of those firearm owners are, in fact, responsible and abide by our laws. But we also know that far too often, firearms can fall into the wrong hands or be present in dangerous circumstances. Madam Speaker, as a former police officer and police chief, I have far too many times been required to go to the scene of firearm tragedies where young people and innocent citizens have been gunned down in the streets, and where the impact of firearm violence impacts not only those victims, but their families and their communities. Last summer, Madam Speaker, I went to a community in Toronto that had already experienced 22 violent gun incidents in the month of July. And what that meant in that community is every child knew someone who had been the victim of a gun crime. That generational trauma demands a response, an appropriate response from all Canadians. Madam Speaker, I've also had the unfortunate duty to attend funerals for police officers and for citizens who've been killed with these guns. And those are the things that I think should deepen all of our resolve to take action. We have listened to the strong advocacy of the victims of the École Polytechnique in Nova Scotia, at the mosque in Quebec, and at tragedies throughout the country. We have also witnessed with horror the use of some of these weapons in mass shootings around the world. And Madam Speaker, we have taken action. As you'll recall, last May 1st, our government, by order in council, prohibited over 1,500 weapons. With Bill C-21 introduced today, we are taking actions to complete that prohibition. We have, through the legislation, established the conditions which are necessary to secure and set controls for the newly prohibited firearms. Under this legislation, all of those in possession of such newly prohibited firearms will be required to acquire a license to possess the weapon. The firearm will have to be registered as a prohibited weapon. There will be no grandfathering as was previously done, but rather we are imposing through this legislation strict prohibitions on the sale, transfer, and transport of this weapon. And we are imposing complete prohibitions on their use. The use of these newly prohibited weapons will be a criminal offense. We are also imposing strict conditions on the storage of these weapons, rendering these newly prohibited firearms legally unusable as a firearm. Madam Speaker, we have relied on the advice of law enforcement and our various officials across the country to determine the best way to manage safely these weapons that are prevalent in our society. But I also want to be clear, there's nothing actually in this legislation that speaks of a buyback program, but we also believe that those Canadians who purchase these guns legally that we have now prohibited need to be treated fairly. And we are imposing appropriate and necessary prohibitions on their sale and their use and restrictions on their storage. But we also intend to offer the people who purchase these guns legally an opportunity to surrender them and to be fairly compensated for them. Madam Speaker, this bill does much more than just complete the prohibition. We have also looked very carefully in this legislation at all of the ways in which criminals gain access to guns. And as I've said, we have seen a very concerning increase in gun violence in cities and communities right across this country. It manifests itself in different ways, but we know that in almost every circumstance, criminals get their guns from one of three ways. They are either smuggled across our borders from the United States, they are stolen from lawful gun owners or for gun retailers, or they're criminally diverted from those who purchase them legally and then sell them illegally. Madam Speaker, in consultation with law enforcement, we have looked at all of the ways in which criminals gain access to guns, and we have taken strong action in Bill C-21 to close off that supply of guns. And for example, the concern of guns that are coming in from across the border. We've heard very many times about concern from law enforcement, but also from communities across the country about the proliferation of firearms, particularly handguns, that are smuggled in from the United States. Madam Speaker, I recently had a conversation with my counterpart in the United States, and we are committed to establishing a task force, a bilateral task force on both sides of our country for law enforcement to work more collaboratively together to help prevent the importation of these firearms. And in Bill C-21, we are also taking strong action to increase the penalty for gun smuggling and to provide law enforcement and our border service officers with both the resources and access to the data they need to be effective in identifying the source of these guns and for cutting off that supply and to deal more effectively to deter and to detect and to prosecute those individuals and organizations that are responsible for smuggling these guns into our country. But Madam Speaker, let us also be clear that smuggling is not the only way. And quite often we hear from gun retailers and the gun lobby in this country that we should only look at somebody else's guns, not theirs. But the reality, unfortunately, in this country, Madam Speaker, that in many parts of the country, crime guns are not just smuggled across the border. And in fact, I think it's important to listen to some of the police chiefs. And for example, the chief of Saskatoon has recently said that guns in his community, crime guns in his community, are not being smuggled across the border, but rather are being stolen from legal gun owners. We've also heard from the chief in Regina, who very clearly said that again the guns in his community are not coming across the border, but either are guns that are legally owned, obtained through theft or through straw purchase. And the chief in Edmonton, who also opined that only 5 to 10% of the crime guns in his community in the city of Edmonton are actually smuggled across the border, and the rest come from legal gun owners, from theft and straw purchasing. And so, Madam Speaker, it's important in this legislation that we address both those sources of supply as well. And that's why, Madam Speaker, we're introducing in this legislation strict new restrictions on the storage of handguns in this country that will require all handgun owners to store their weapons more securely in a safer vault that will be prescribed and described in the regulations of this legislation. And it will also require gun retailers to store their weapons when on display and in storage more securely to prevent the theft. And Madam Speaker, I would just highlight just an example. A couple of years ago, 2 young girls and 9 Torontonians were injured in a terrible and tragic gun incident. And the firearm in that case was stolen some 3 months before from a gun shop in Saskatoon. And over 3 months, it made its way into Toronto and was used in a horrific crime. And so keeping those guns out of our community is an important element of Bill C-21. And finally, Madam Speaker, we also deal with the source of supply through criminal diversion. We've seen a number of examples where individuals have purchased a large number of handguns, have made an attempt to disguise their origin by filing off the serial numbers and then selling them for an enormous profit to the criminal market and to the gangs that commit these violent acts in our communities. those crimes, in order to be detected and therefore deterred, we need to ensure that law enforcement has access to the resources and the data that they need to properly trace those weapons. And that's why, Madam Speaker, first of all, we've in this legislation provided law enforcement with that access. But we're also making significant investments. And yesterday I advised this House that through our investments in British Columbia, for example, we've just opened up a brand new forensic firearms laboratory that will assist law enforcement in determining the origin of these weapons and to hold those individuals who purchase them legally and sell them illegally to account. Madam Speaker, we also know that in addition to crime guns that get into the hands of criminals, there are also circumstances where the presence of a firearm, which may have been legally obtained, in certain potentially dangerous situations can lead to tragedy. We see it in incidents of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, where a firearm may be legally acquired and be in a home, but when the circumstances of that home change so that it becomes a place of violence and threat and coercion, Madam Speaker, the presence of a firearm in those circumstances can lead to deadly consequences. And so although the police currently has some limited authority to remove firearms from those circumstances, we know, Madam Speaker, that in many, many cases of domestic and intimate partner violence, the police are not aware of the presence of a firearm or even the crime is reported to them. And so through this legislation, we are empowering others, empowering victims, those who support them, legal aid clinics, other people in our society to be able to take effective action through what we call extreme risk clause to remove those firearms from that potentially dangerous situation. Similarly, Madam Speaker, in a situation where an individual may become suicidal or is emotionally disturbed, where the presence of a firearm in that situation could lead to a deadly outcome. And Madam Speaker, we are empowering doctors, family members, clergymen, elders in a community to take effective action to remove firearms, utilizing the provisions of this legislation to remove firearms from that potentially deadly situation. And finally, Madam Speaker, it also applies to those who engage in acts of hatred and extremism online, and where there is evidence, and we have seen this in a number of tragic incidents right in this country, where individuals have given indication of their deadly intent online, and where that information is available, we are now empowering those who become aware of it to take action, to remove firearms from that deadly situation and help keep people safe. And Madam Speaker, I want to advise this House that in every jurisdiction in the United States, 19 states have implemented extreme risk laws, or what are also referred to as red flag laws. And in those states, Madam Speaker, we have seen that strong evidence that these measures save lives. And Madam Speaker, that is our intent with this legislation. This legislation is not intended in any way to infringe upon the legitimate use of firearms for hunting or sports shooting purposes. It is, Madam Speaker, first and foremost, a public safety bill. It aims to keep firearms out of the hands of those who would commit violent crimes with them, and to remove firearms from situations that can become dangerous and therefore be made deadly by the presence of a firearm. And Madam Speaker, that is the intent of this legislation. We are taking some additional measures within this legislation. We, for example, have listened to law enforcement, which for over 30 years has been urging the Government of Canada to take action to prohibit what are often referred to as replica firearms. Madam Speaker, these are devices which are designed and appear absolutely indistinguishable from dangerous firearms. And the police have urged governments to take action because they have seen these devices are often used in crime. They have been used to hurt people, and they present an overwhelming and impossible challenge for law enforcement when confronted with individuals with these devices, and it has in many circumstances led to potentially tragic consequences. And so, Madam Speaker, in this legislation, we are also introducing legislation to listening to the law enforcement to prohibit those devices. And if I may be clear, this isn't about BB guns and paint guns and pellet guns that people use recreationally. It's about devices that are designed to appear as exact replicas of dangerous firearms. And it is that exact appearance which really creates the danger around these devices, and so we're taking action. We're also taking action to strengthen our provisions with respect to large capacity magazines. And Madam Speaker, I have been to far too many shootings in my city of Toronto where we've seen, whereas years ago, when someone perhaps may have discharged a revolver, there would be 2 or 3 shots fired. But now with dangerous semi-automatic handguns and large capacity magazines, it can lead to situations where we have literally dozens and dozens of rounds that have been discharged, putting far more innocent people at risk. And so we have seen that those devices often are modified and changed to allow for a higher capacity, and we are taking action to prevent that. We're closing a loophole with respect to the importation of information, and we're making other consequential amendments to this legislation, all intended to keep communities safe. And Madam Speaker, I also want to be clear that companion to this important legislation, we've also made significant investments, first of all, in law enforcement. We saw several years ago that a previous government cut enormous amounts of funding from the police, eliminating RCMP officers and border service officers, weakening our controls at the border, and compromising our ability to deal effectively with organized crime. And Madam Speaker, we've been reinvesting in policing and in border services to restore Canada's capacity to secure our borders and to keep our communities safe. And Madam Speaker, for example, we've made over $214 million available even to municipal and Indigenous police services, because we know that they do important work in dealing with guns and gangs in their community and reducing gun violence. And so we've made those investments in policing, and those investments are important. But Madam Speaker, they're not the only investments that are necessary in order to keep our communities safe. And that's why, Madam Speaker, we're also investing in communities. And through our fall economic statement, we're making $250 million over the next 5 years available to community organizations that, Madam Speaker, do extraordinary work in our communities and working with young people and helping to change the social conditions that give rise to crime and violence in our community. Madam Speaker, I believe this is a comprehensive approach to gun safety in this country. It's always extraordinary to me that some people are afraid to talk about guns when we're talking about gun violence. But in my experience, Madam Speaker, countries that have strong and appropriate gun control are safer countries. And we have also seen that in those countries that have weak gun laws, as have been opposed by some in this House, those countries experience far too often the tragedy of gun violence. Madam Speaker, I would, if I may repeat, that in this country, firearm ownership is a privilege and not a right. That makes us fundamentally different from countries like the United States, where the right to bear arms is a constitutionally protected right. It is not in Canada. Canada, like many other very sensible countries, has taken the appropriate step of banning firearms that have no place in our society. They're not designed for hunting, and they're not designed for sport. They're designed basically for soldiers to hunt other soldiers, to kill people, Madam Speaker. And tragically, that's what they've been used for. That's why we've prohibited them. And through the actions of this bill, we are taking strong measures to ensure that these firearms cannot be ever legally used in this country. We believe that these provisions are appropriate, necessary, will be effective, and that they are fair, because we acknowledge as well that those who purchased those now prohibited firearms did so legally. And now that we've prohibited them, we want to ensure that they can never be used to commit a violent crime at any time in this country. Madam Speaker, we've drawn a bright line in this legislation. We are not a country where people arm themselves to defend themselves against each other. We don't carry guns in this country for self-protection. We rely on the law. The rule of law, peace, order, and good government is a strongly held Canadian value. And we do not arm our citizens, as they do in some other countries, to protect themselves and to use for self-defense. Firearms in this country, Madam Speaker, are only appropriate for hunting and for sports shooting purposes. And there is nothing in this legislation that in any way infringes upon those activities in this country. Notwithstanding, some will try to make the case, but frankly, it's a false case. It's based on a false assumption. And the assumption is, first of all firearms in this country, all firearms represent a danger. They are offensive weapons by their very definition. And therefore, we regulate them in Canada. We regulate them very strictly. Additionally, some of those firearms are very dangerous. And so we appropriately add additional restrictions, and we restrict those weapons, handguns, for example. And finally, there are some weapons that frankly have no place in a society for which firearms can only be used for hunting and sport purposes. Firearms that were designed for combat, that are tactical weapons, that used to be marketed as assault weapons before those weapons began to be prohibited by countries like New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, and even in the United States for a decade, these weapons were prohibited. And so, Madam Speaker, we are doing the right thing and taking the appropriate action to keep Canadians safe. It builds upon the effective measures that we brought forward in Bill C-71, which we are in the process of fully implementing over the next few months. And we believe that coupled together with our investments, both pieces of legislation will help fulfill our promise to Canadians that we will do everything necessary to strengthen gun control in this country and to keep Canadians safe. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Bruce Grey, Owen Sound.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a very simple question through you to the Minister. Same question I've actually been asking the Minister here in the House for almost a year now and in written questions. It's about data and substantiation of how any of these firearms that have been prohibited or the measures taken through Bill C-21 will somehow reduce gun violence in this country. Simple question. The data. Where is the evidence? The Minister mentioned he saw 22 tragic gun violent crimes in the Toronto area last year alone. I'd like him just to provide the statistics. Out of those 22 gun crimes, how many were done with legal firearms? As well, I'd like the Minister to clarify and confirm that he just acknowledged that he's bringing back a long gun registry for those prohibited firearms that they've now prohibited. As well, he mentioned that airsoft and replica firearms that he's now prohibiting as well. Would he acknowledge that replica firearms have been prohibited in this country for a number of years now? And finally, he again mentioned that these firearms that were designed that he has prohibited, these 1,500 firearms plus that were prohibited last year, were designed by the military or for military use. I asked him last year just to name one of them that have been prohibited that have ever been or is still in use by the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, it's always a bit of a mystery to me how a party that eliminated a registry of and the collection of data as it pertains to firearms and did everything they can to undermine even Stats Canada effort to collect data on this issue now complain that there's no data. And one of the reasons there is insufficient data is because of the actions of the previous government. But, Madam Speaker, let me be very clear on something. We are not introducing a new registry, another gun lobby talking point. But the reality is that in Canadian law and during the entire period of the Conservative government, prohibited weapons in this country must be both licensed and registered, and we are just following the law as it exists. There is no new registry here, but these newly prohibited weapons are now, in fact, in law, prohibited weapons, and therefore will have to be, everyone in possession of them will have to have a license in order to possess that prohibited weapon. And because they are now prohibited weapons, they'll also have to be registered as all prohibited weapons always had to be. And Madam Speaker, let me just talk a little bit about the use of guns. I cited a couple of examples, and I don't disagree with the member that a lot of guns that are used, for example, in gun crime in Toronto are smuggled guns. And in my experience, and over 10 years, I traced the origin of every crime gun in Canada, so I have really good data on that. And about 70% were smuggled across the border, and about 30% were obtained they were either legally owned or they were stolen or criminally diverted. And so we had good data in that city, but it's not consistently collected across the country. We're changing that, Madam Speaker, by the way, by investing in appropriate data collection around this issue.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for St. John's East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I have a question for the Minister. The New Democrats have long been in support of banning these assault rifles, trying to make our cities safer, opposing smuggling, and trying to get the government to actually do something about it. But we do have a problem with the Minister when he says that recreational use of firearms are okay. But where handguns are treated in one way under this legislation and allowing them to continue except where restricted by municipalities, airsoft rifles, which are used recreationally across this country by many organizations and groups and recreational activity and cause no harm, are being treated as same as assault weapons. Will the Minister recognize that this is a totally different category and try to find some way of allowing this to continue, this recreational use? The banning of airsoft rifles is putting them in the same category as prohibited weapons, and that is wrong.
Honourable Minister.
I thank very much the member from St. John for what was a very important question. First of all, handguns do represent a very significant danger. It's why we restrict them. And just to be very clear, in this legislation, we are imposing very strict national restrictions on handguns, on their storage and on their sale and on their use. And those restrictions apply in every place. We've also listened to municipalities that have said that they would like to do more. And we're prepared to work with communities that want to do more to keep their citizens safe. It's a responsibility we all have. And Madam Speaker, with respect to the airsoft rifles that the member references, there's no problem with those devices except when they are designed and manufactured to exactly replicate dangerous firearms so that they are indistinguishable from those firearms. We've listened to the law enforcement community that's passed a number of resolutions. And by the way, I consulted with the law enforcement community about why they wanted this done. They said these devices have been used in crime. In Winnipeg, for example, Chief Danny Smythe identified that 215 replica firearms were used to commit crimes in his city just last year. And his response to Bill C-21 is he said, we think you're onto something. But I also spoke to the president of the CACP, who strongly supported and expressed their appreciation that government finally listened to law enforcement to take effective action to remove devices that are exactly replicating these dangerous firearms, and there really is no place for them in our society. They represent an unacceptable risk.
Et commentaires de l'honorable député de Shefford.
The Honourable Member for Shefford. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank the Honourable Minister for this explanation of Bill C-21. I've spoken with the group Police se souvient, and that group also said that this bill has flaws because it doesn't discuss handguns, the fact that there's differences between different municipalities. There was a resolution at the National Assembly. So ultimately, given that this bill seems so flawed, is this government ready to go back to the drawing board, work with opposition parties at committees, and review this bill and see if it can be improved?
I thank the member for the question. Let me be very clear. There is a substantial amount in this bill that actually deals with handguns. And as I said, it imposes additional restrictions and gives access to the law enforcement to do a better job of keeping guns out of our country, but that are being smuggled across the border, to prevent their theft through stronger storage requirements, and to assist law enforcement to detect and therefore deter and prosecute those who are, through straw purchase, are purchasing them legally and selling them illegally. There are very strong measures here dealing with handguns. I've also, this government listened to the strong advocacy and was deeply motivated by the tragedy of École Polytechnique, where 14 women were gunned down because they were women. And in that terrible crime, they used a Mini Ruger. The killer used a Mini Ruger 14. In May, we prohibited that weapon. And the advocacy of Police se souvient over nearly 30 years to have that weapon prohibited, we listened and we took action on that. And we are now completing that prohibition to ensure that those weapons can never be legally used in Canada again.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you.
The Honourable Member is on mute.
Sorry. I was sure I'd remove the mute. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And thanks to the Honourable Minister. I appreciate his pointing out that we do not have in this country rights to bear arms. I also note that under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we don't have rights to property at all. So much of the rhetoric that I see coming against controls on firearms, such as from a group called the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights, right from the get-go, they don't understand Canadian law. But I did have initially very strong sense of disappointment that the buyback program wasn't mandatory. The Honourable Minister will know that in briefing me and the Green Caucus, that he and the Minister of Justice said that they decided that the New Zealand mandatory firearm buyback hadn't worked because it was mandatory. I just want to say to the Minister, I've been digging into it since the Minister told me that. And everything I can see suggests that, yes, in New Zealand, there were probably about 170,000 semi-automatic weapons that the Prime Minister wanted removed after the Christchurch massacre. Of the 170,000 that may have been there, only 56,000 were brought back in the mandatory buyback program. And I want the Honourable Minister, I wonder if there are any other countries on which we have modelled the current approach, which is, as you said, not in legislation, but is running parallel along with it.
The Honourable Minister.
I want to thank the member for a very thoughtful question. And yes, we have had discussions on this. I want to be really clear. A buyback of these weapons, first of all, the Canadians that bought these weapons did so at the time legally. We've since subsequently prohibited them, and therefore we are taking steps to remove those firearms. But it is not intended here for a confiscation program, and that would be a very challenging thing to do. We did look very carefully at buyback programs that have been initiated in Australia and the United Kingdom. They were a little bit more distant. One of the things we learned from all of those circumstances is that governments have to do the important work of getting control of all of these firearms first. And that's what Bill C-21 does. It enables us to impose...
And we have to resume debate. The Honourable Member for Lakeland. Is she on?
Okay, she is.
Okay. The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Goodness, thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. You'd think after a year of this that I, could handle it, but hope springs eternal. Madam Speaker, I do want to start by saying Conservatives have and will always support common sense firearm regulations that keep Canadians and communities safe and respect their rights. In Bill C-21, there are some things Conservatives have been calling for and can support. Many things that completely target the wrong people and the wrong groups if the aim really is to improve and protect public safety, and there are crucial areas of concern that are not addressed in this bill at all. Conservatives have always urged the Liberals to focus on and to target Canada's legislation and enforcement resources towards the primary source of most gun crime in Canada, illegally smuggled firearms in the hands of gangs and criminals. That's why we support certain measures here, like increasing the penalty for gun smuggling, something Conservatives have advocated for years, authorizing disclosure to Canadian law enforcement agencies when there are reasonable grounds to suspect a firearms license is used for straw purchasing, improving the ability of the CBSA to manage inadmissibility to Canada when foreign nationals commit offenses upon entry to Canada, including firearms-related offenses, and transferring the responsibility for transborder criminality from the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. Conservatives are committed to actually strengthening and securing public safety through real action to tackle gun crime head on. Conservatives have always said we would increase funding and coordination for border security to crack down on illegal firearms smuggling, restore mandatory minimum sentences to keep violent gang members off the streets, and focus on gangs and criminals instead of making life more difficult for law-abiding firearms owners and retailers by ending automatic bail, revoking parole for gang members, new and tougher sentences for ordering or involvement in violent gang crime. The Liberals do the opposite. They're big on rhetoric, but short on real action. In fact, the day after the Liberals announced Bill C-21, they announced Bill C-22, which incredibly eliminates mandatory minimums for unauthorized possession of a firearm, possession of a prohibited firearm, possession of a weapon obtained by crime, weapons trafficking, reckless discharge of a firearm with intent to wound or endanger a person, robbery with a firearm, so reductions for all those sentences. C-22 reduces sentences for a number of other horrible offenses, including sexual assault, kidnapping, human trafficking, abduction of people under 14, motor vehicle theft, and arson. Conservatives focus on outcomes and whether laws will actually achieve objectives. What Bill C-21 proves is the Liberals, as always, are more concerned with appearances. They play fast and loose with the facts, make up words to scare, and ignore the actual problems. Whilst with C-21, they are effectively trading on Canadians' fear and safety for short-term political gain. Because the reality is that taking firearms away from law-abiding citizens does nothing to stop dangerous criminals and gangs who obtain their guns illegally and already don't follow laws, don't get licenses, and don't care about firearms classifications. It just continues this Liberal government's ongoing preoccupation with taking firearms off of regulated ranges while leaving illegal guns on the streets in the hands of those gangs and criminals who will never comply. In June 2019, the former Toronto police chief was asked about banning handguns in Canada. He said, quote, "I believe that would be potentially a very expensive proposition, but just as importantly, it would not, in my opinion, be perhaps the most effective measure in restricting the access that criminals would have to such weapons, because we'd still have a problem with them being smuggled across the border." Of course, the former Toronto police chief I'm referring to is the current Minister of Public Safety. Bill C-21 creates conditions on federal firearms licenses to restrict handgun storage or transport within municipalities that pass such bylaws. I'll say that again. The bylaws would be conditions on licenses. So this measure literally, specifically, and only targets lawful Canadians who already have the paperwork and comply with the rules. This section will lead to yet another layer of confusing, overlapping regulations and a patchwork of rules for already law-abiding Canadians within and between communities, while violations could result in 2 years imprisonment or permanent license revocations, and doing nothing to actually crack down on illegal gun smuggling, trading, and gang crimes with guns. Many law enforcement officials have already said this measure will not be effective, including the current RCMP commissioner, the former OPP commissioner, police chief of Vancouver, former president of the Canadian Association of the Chiefs of Police, representatives of the Winnipeg and Halifax police services, and police chiefs of Regina and of Saskatoon. Provinces are already speaking out against Bill C-21, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, and Manitoba, whose premier said, quote, "It's just not going to work." In 2019, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police did not support calls for a ban on handguns. And the former president, Vancouver Police Chief Adam Palmer, says, quote, "In every single case, there are already offenses for that. They're already breaking the law, and the criminal law in Canada addresses all of those circumstances. The firearms laws in Canada are actually very good right now. They're very strict." Former OPP Commissioner Chris Lewis says, quote, "This municipal handgun ban is ridiculous. It would only impact legal owners. The gangbangers are already possessing, carrying them in defiance of the criminal code, and don't fear police, whose hands are tied, and weak judicial systems." And Toronto Police Services President Mike McCormack says, quote, "There's no way in my world or any world I know that this would have an impact on somebody who's going to go out, buy an illegal gun, and use it to kill another person or shoot another person." But this is a classic Liberal smokescreen. It has absolutely no impact on the illicit use of illegal firearms in crime. Of course, criminals and gangs don't carry licenses or register their illegally obtained firearms and won't be deterred by municipal bylaws when they don't even care about the criminal code. And the fact that at least 80% of guns used in Canadian gun crimes are illegally smuggled in from the States shows that enabling towns and cities to ban handguns from licensed owners will have little to no impact on actual public safety. In 2016, a 2-year-old father of 4, whose children were only 6 and 5, along with 1-year-old twins, was enjoying a night out with friends in Toronto when he was shot and killed by a stray bullet. Now a mother of 3 carrying the lifetime grief of the loss of a child, his mom, Evelyn Fox, advocates to support at-risk youth and prevent youth involvement in gang activity. She believes banning handguns in Canada is, quote, "nonsense," because, quote, "street level wise, they'll get handguns anyway." She says, quote, "I also would like to know how it is that penalizing law-abiding gun owners with a gun ban is going to deter gun violence on our streets when 80%, if not more, is coming across the border." And she's right. In Toronto, despite the new Liberal Order and Council prohibition of thousands of firearms, there were 462 shootings in 2020, an increase over 2018 when there was no prohibition order. 2019 was a record year, and was a record year. Since 2014, shootings in Toronto have increased 161%. Obviously, residents and families are worried about this reality, causing sleepless nights, untold heartbreak, and anxiety about security and whether kids can grow up carefree in peaceful neighborhoods. So how galling that Bill C-21 won't actually do anything to make it more safe, while the Liberals claim otherwise. In 2019, Toronto's police chief Mark Saunders reported that most guns used in crime were illegally smuggled in. He said, quote, "When it comes to the handguns, I believe 82% of the crime guns in the city are coming from the U.S." Peel Police Association President Adrian Woolley says, quote, there are a lot of guns out there, and they're not legal ones from target shooters, but illegal ones smuggled in from the U.S. For the 2017-18 year, CBSA seized 751 illegal firearms at the U.S.-Canada border, 696 the next year, and 753 for the year after that. The CBSA has already seized 166 firearms for the first quarter of this fiscal year. Canada's border agents should be commended for that good work, and lawmakers should support their efforts to improve public safety by getting tougher on gun criminals and gun smugglers when they're caught, which is exactly what our Conservative colleague from Markham Unionville tried to do when he proposed Bill C-238 that would crack down on gun smuggling, knowingly possessing illegally smuggled guns by increasing sentences, and make it harder for gun runners to get out on bail. But the Liberals and the NDP voted against this public safety legislation the week before the announcement of Bill C-21. When asked why the government isn't getting tougher on criminals, the Liberals defaulted is to say they implemented a, quote, prohibition on military-style assault rifles. First, the term military-style assault rifle is, of course, invented with no legal definition. But it does sound scary when the reality is that fully automatic fire rifles have been prohibited for use outside of the military in Canada since the 1970s. The Prime Minister said he made a law so people can't purchase firearms without producing a license, but that's false since the 70s. Along the spirit of making things up, just last Saturday, the member for York South-Weston told a crowd of gun crime victims and families that his Liberal government's gun grab includes, quote, AR-135 submachine guns, except those absolutely do not even exist. Unfortunately, it's easy to see why lawful, well-intentioned urban and rural firearms owners, collectors, hunters, sports shooters, enthusiasts, retailers, people who enjoy this Canadian heritage are skeptical of the Liberals. To say nothing of the radical shift in Bill C-21 that creates a one-sided, guilty until proven innocent, ask questions later regime focused on Canadians who already do the filings and have the licenses under Canada's stringent regulations and vigorous vetting processes for prohibition orders and warrantless search and seizures. That is ripe for abuse and conflicts, while bogging down already backlogged courts and law enforcement resources, when right now there are multiple overlapping systems to ensure law enforcement can respond to urgent situations involving threats to personal and public safety, as they must. The new approach actually may even take longer and can easily have unintended consequences and deliver opposite outcomes. But this pattern of saying one thing and doing another, of literally making things up, of not having the evidence to support the legislation to show it will achieve stated outcomes, should make every other Canadian, every single Canadian, question and challenge the Liberals to prove their laws will actually make a difference for public safety and combat gun crimes too. Which brings me to the framework for a voluntary confiscation program. A 2018 Public Safety Canada paper, Reducing Violent Crime, a dialogue on handguns and assault weapons, explained why confiscating firearms from lawful licensed owners will be ineffective at reducing gun crime in Canada. The report says, quote, the vast majority of owners of handguns and of other firearms in Canada lawfully abide by requirements, and most gun crimes are not committed with legally owned firearms. And, quote, in most cases, individuals own handguns, either in the context of sports shooting activities or because those handguns form a part of a collection. Any ban would primarily affect legal firearms owners. The public safety minister recently said the government doesn't know how many firearms will fall under the confiscation program, but claims it's in the range of 200,000 and says at an average price of $1,300 per firearm, it will cost taxpayers in the range of $250 to $260 million. Of course, experts say that the Liberals are way off, and this confiscation program could cost as much as $5 billion when it's all said and done. The fact is the Liberals don't actually have any structure in place because no private sector proponents have agreed to run the program after 2 public requests for bids. It really does say something when highly reputable major firms look at the government's purported analysis and cost assumptions and decide they won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. The Liberals still haven't been clear on how they will address retailers left holding the bag with inventory they can't sell or return to manufacturers either. Phil Harnois, the owner of P&D Enterprises in Alberta, says 40% of his annual sales were firearms that are now banned and that thousands of dollars of inventory became worthless overnight. The president of the National Police Federation, Brian Sauvé, says, quote, the evidence is that illegal gun trafficking leads to criminals owning guns, which leads to crimes with firearms. We need to look at the source of the problem. The vast majority of gun crime committed in Canada is by gangs and criminals using already illegal guns, most often illegally smuggled in. That needs to be repeated because Bill C-21 clearly misses the mark. Sylvia Jones, spokesperson for Ontario Solicitor General, agrees. She says, quote, as law enforcement experts routinely highlight, it has not been demonstrated that banning legal firearms and targeting law-abiding citizens would meaningfully address the problem of gun violence. The Liberals have shown, of course, though, that they don't really believe their list of banned firearms in the hands of licensed law-abiding firearms owners are a real threat either. Otherwise, why the confusing step of banning them but allowing Canadians to keep them in their homes so long as they're registered with the government? It's very confounding. But what is clear is that Bill C-21 finds a way to create a boondoggle that will again create a long gun registry because some of the now prohibited firearms are long guns, and it will cost taxpayers billions of dollars while delivering no concrete results to improve and protect the public safety of Canadians suffering at the hands of gangs and criminals carrying out the vast majority of gun violence and crime in Canada. Another measure that's glaring in its obvious irrelevance to improving public safety in Canada while also imposing major consequences on everyday people is the prohibition of the importation, exportation, and sale of all non-regulated air guns that look like modern firearms. Here's the deal. The Liberals are actually imposing a ban on airsoft and a partial ban on paintball. Any rational common sense person can see that toy guns are not responsible for shootings causing deaths in Canadian cities. Criminals and gangs with illegal guns are tragically ending the lives of Canadians, while this provision in C-21s ends hundreds of livelihoods, legacies, and jobs, and outlaws an entirely harmless hobby enjoyed by more than 60,000 Canadians. Airsoft in Canada says the Canadian airsoft market is worth $100 million, and over 260 businesses in Canada are related to the paintball or airsoft community. The Quebec Airsoft Federation estimates the industry brings in over $10 million per year in Quebec alone. Distributors and retailers are uncertain about what to do with current stock and with stock on order because all of it would be rendered worthless immediately with no option to offset losses because the bill prohibits sales. And it won't impact only businesses that directly sell hobby and competition practice guns, but also retailers of protective equipment and accessories, as well as the clubs and owners of sports facilities that have focused businesses largely or solely around these activities. This whole industry will be devastated. Matt Wazilich, who owns Canadian Airsoft Imports and says the ban, quote, confirms our worst fears. Frank Chong owns Toronto Airsoft, Canada's largest airsoft retailer. He says it looks like it's doomsday for us at this point. Ziming Wan of Black Blitz Airsoft in Waterloo says we're basically all going to have to shut down. It's the death of the sport as we know it. Joe Kimpson of Flag Raiders in Kitchener says you'll see the demise of airsoft in Canada. 74% of these businesses expect to lose over half their revenue because of C-21, and 7% of them expect to be out of business for good. There are approximately 3,000 employees working in those affected businesses. It's unconscionable that half of them will now lose their jobs, and not a single life will be saved for it. It's hard to see how the Liberals are materially protecting the well-being and safety of Canadians by banning toy guns, shuttering more businesses, and killing 1,500 jobs, while Canada's unemployment rate is already the highest in the G7. Mark from Atuk Manufacturing in Lakeland says, quote, I was given no notice, no warning, no consultation. The hard work I've put in for over 8 years has been erased and my customers wrongfully criminalized. Why aren't criminals being as negatively impacted as my small business? A petition called Stop Bill C-21 is circulating in the hobby community, and 30,000 Canadians have already signed it. That's because Canadians know what experts have been saying all along, which is also what conservatives have been saying. And that's what's missing from these Liberals is any meaningful emphasis or major legal framework targeting the main source of gun crime in Canada. It's good to see some measures to help the CBSA and a small increase in penalties for gun smuggling. But those aspects of Bill C-21 appear more like a footnote in what seems to be really a broader strategy, primarily concerned with targeting already law-abiding members of Canadian society. One would read this bill and assume the main goal is to be a nuisance to the legal firearms community. It isn't really obvious at all that the aim of Bill C-21 is to improve public safety. And the tragedy? It's this, that for all the big words and tough talk from the Liberals, it's the very real victims of growing gun violence in Canadian citizens and their families who are forced to bear the brunt of these failed Liberal policies and experiments. What's worse is the evidence is available for all of us to see. Experts, law enforcement, policymakers, they all agree that concrete strategies and legislation must be directed at criminals and gangs and supports for at-risk youth. Conservatives will always support a common sense approach to firearms legislation with concrete outcomes that protect personal and public safety. But C21 doesn't get to the bottom of addressing the major cause of gun crime in Canada. And all MPs really owe it to the victims of all violent crime in Canada, past and future, to get serious about gun smuggling, gangs, and criminals. Because as Evelyn Fox says, quote, I see the homicides happen, and it's almost like a re-trigger for me to think that another mother has to go through this, and another mother has to deal with the fact that they aren't going to see their children again. So because Bill C-21 won't actually make any difference to that, Conservatives will strongly oppose, and if it passes, repeal Bill C-21.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Minister for Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I'm a little confused by the member's comments because she and when she was a member of the previous government was actually responsible for cutting enormous amounts of funding and staffing from the police and from our border service officers. And our government's brought forward measures to refund those and restaff those important functions. She voted against it. But Madam Speaker, I just want to clarify something. We know that, and we've listened very carefully to law enforcement, and we've listened very carefully to the victims of gun violence, and we're taking strong action in response to their urgent appeals to strengthen gun control in this country. But we know that the Conservative leader has promised the gun lobby that he will weaken gun control. He has, for example, the gun lobby tells us that he's promised them that he'll make assault rifles legal again, that he'll remove the restrictions on handguns, that he'll eliminate all controls over large capacity magazines, that he'll eliminate stronger background checks, that he'll allow you to carry concealed weapons. The gun lobby has said very clearly that they've told the Conservative leader what he's to do, and he's agreed to do it. And so can the member confirm that it is the intention of a Conservative leader and party to weaken gun controls in the way that they have been ordered to do by the gun lobby?
Honourable Member for Lakeland.
What on earth is this minister talking about? And what a deeply concerning and troubling and frankly frickin' ridiculous response from the one person who has the most power and the most ability to make a real difference.
We have a point of order from we have a point of order from the Honourable Member for Kingston and the Islands.
Madam Speaker, as you know, and I'm sure this member knows, you can't say indirectly what you can't say directly. So when you use a word like friggin', it's pretty clear what you're actually trying to say. So I would encourage you to encourage this member to use proper language and decorum.
I'm sorry. Yes, we try to keep our vocabulary as respectful as possible. The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Okay, I'll put it this way. What a mind-boggling, irrelevant, political, partisan, ridiculous, superficial approach from the man charged with the chief responsibility to protect the public safety and security of every single Canadian. What a slap in the face to people in Toronto, to families, to people who live in neighborhoods and cities right across the country where criminals and gangs are terrorizing their streets, are killing their children, are making them wonder if they can have peaceful sleeps at night, are seeing their communities change all around them, and want the Canadian government to take action to crack down on the criminals and the gangs and the violence that puts them at risk. What is this? How can that actually possibly be the first question and comment by the Minister of Public Safety in this debate? I mean, that right there, it just shows exactly what the problem is.
The Honourable Member for Saanich-Schofield.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And the Honourable Member for Lakeland, her comment parenthetically that somehow it weakens protections in Canada to get rid of mandatory minimums. I just wanted to ask her if she's familiar with the fact that all of the literature around mandatory minimum sentences makes it very clear that they don't reduce crime, that they increase costs of prisons that are costs borne by provincial governments, that they lead to overcrowding. There isn't any evidence that mandatory minimums are anything other than a waste of public funds and actually endanger Canadians more. And I wonder if she has any literature to the contrary.
The Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Well, actually, there have been several recent convictions where mandatory minimum sentences were upheld, and thank goodness they did, because you know what they ensured? They ensured that dangerous criminals, dangerous offenders who had committed violent acts against Canadians stayed in jail. And I think that every single Canadian would value that measure when they know that that's a real action to make sure that we will all be kept safe. So here again, this is of course, we know what this is all about, right? It's actually about ideological objections. It's actually a discussion and rationale that is being made. But what's really behind it is an out-of-touch attack on law-abiding, lawful, peaceful Canadians while trying to look like while trying to look like politicians are actually doing something about public safety and cracking down on crime.
Questions and comments.
Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to ask the Honourable Member, through you, of course, there are many social determinants that create the crime that we are seeing in our cities. And during this pandemic, of course, things have become extremely exacerbated. Homelessness is on the rise. In my city, in London, housing is out of reach. It's not affordable anymore, and we are seeing that across the board. So when New Democrats talk about investment in those social programs, in trying to provide cost-saving measures with pharmacare, or shifting how we tax the rich and introducing wealth taxes to make those different choices, this Conservative Party, of which the member is part, doesn't support those. So when we talk about the increases in poverty and increases in crime, can she talk about why her party doesn't support those social programs?
Member for Lakeland, less than a minute.
Okay, sure. Well, what a bizarre thing to say, because in fact, throughout the whole speech, I think actually twice, I talked about the important initiatives that would deal with prevention of youth ending up in gang activity. And certainly colleagues have talked all about, Conservative colleagues have been on the front lines talking about things like dealing with addictions crises, which are driving criminal activity in many communities. And I think the member does raise an important point about the kinds of work that needs to be done with a framework. For example, like our Conservative colleague is just about to, I hope, bring through successfully with the support of all parties, focusing on establishing a national framework, for example, of nonprofit, local, community, faith-based, private organizations that will work together right across the country to reduce recidivism and repeat offenses. That's an example of a real measure that will deal with some of the things that the member is talking about to prevent crime.
The Honourable Member will have 3.5 minutes to pursue answers when we return to the discussion of this bill. It is now time for statement by members. Déclaration des députés, l'honorable